Today we are joined by two truly amazing Moore alumni from the class of 2018, Dominique Evans and Katie Woods. They'll be chatting with Dr. Jonathan Wallis, professor of Art History and Humanities and curator of Fantasy Spell, The Art of Enchantment. This show is currently on view in the galleries, showcasing a variety of physical, digital, and motion-based media, celebrating the growing influence of fantasy as a genre in contemporary art. Dominique and Katie's work is currently featured in the Alumni Gallery on view through March 1st. Dominique Evans majored in illustration and loves visual storytelling, especially through world building and expressive color. After spending some time doing service work with the AmeriCorps, she broke into the animation industry as a visual development artist at Nickelodeon. She's passionate about creating immersive fantasy and sci-fi projects and bringing new worlds to life. She is joining us today from LA. Katie Woods graduated with a degree in animation and game arts from Moore. She's a senior motion designer and illustrator based in San Diego, known for her fun characters, bold colors, and personality-driven motion graphics. Outside her role at Aya Healthcare, Katie works on independent projects for clients like Planned Parenthood, Cubic Orange, and Viasat, and has animated promotional videos for Dungeons & Dragons Spelljammer and designed in-game graphics for Madden 2023. Dr. Jonathan Wallis is a professor of art history and humanities at Moore and the program head for visionary academic honors. He's also a curator and art historian who focuses on the intersection of ethics, socially engaged art, and critical pedagogy. Jonathan's written extensively for journals like Art and the Public Sphere and Women's Art Journal, and he's authored several essays on post-surrealist works. On top of his academic work, Jonathan is also an award-winning fiction author under the pen name Jonathan Nubert. His novel To Spy a Star was recently awarded the 2024 National Fantasy Fan Federation Laureate Award for Best Novel. So before we dive in, please be aware that this session is being recorded. So if you'd rather not be on camera, feel free to keep your video off. And we'll also have a Q&A at the end, so hold on to your questions, and when we get there, you can either unmute or drop them in the chat. So with that, I will pass it over to Katie to get us started.
Hiya, I'm Katie. I am going to set up a little PowerPoint for you guys that I have made. Bear with me really quick while I set that up. You can all see me, I hope. Because I can't see you now. Hi, I'm Katie. I'm a motion graphic designer. That's me. Do my little happy thing. Quick background about me before I get into everything else. I was born and raised in Delaware County. If you've ever heard of Havertown, that's where I'm from. I graduated Moore, as you guys saw, 2018, and I interned in San Diego, where I'm currently at, and moved here post-college. This is my third full-time opportunity now, and I've worked in both technology and entertainment. I'm a full-time motion designer at Aya Healthcare. I'm senior now, woohoo, for about a year. And my work varies a lot depending on the project. So I'm going to kind of give you a quick overview. What is a motion designer? Some stuff that I do, some of my favorite artists in the field. And then I'm planning to show you kind of a step-by-step. Well, I'll show you the work that's featured in the gallery and then a step-by-step of how that work was made. All pretty quick, so I'm going to be going by everything kind of top level. So what is a motion designer? If you didn't know, some of you probably do, some of you probably don't. We're kind of a jack of all trades in the animation business. We'll do like, I guess I say that later on. We design, we make things move, we add effects, basically whatever is needed in a project. We can be one piece of the puzzle, or we could be the whole puzzle itself, the whole pie, that kind of stuff. We work on stuff that's in like social media ads, television ads, marketing presentations, entertainment, product highlights, motion comics, which is the type of work that's currently on display, and more. I primarily work in 2D, but I do have some experience and I've done some projects in 3D as well. We usually work with designers to create these animated pieces, or sometimes we just, like I said, the whole pie, do it all ourselves. You kind of have to know a lot of stuff to be a motion designer. I mean, you don't have to, but you probably should. And if you don't know something, you usually have to be able to figure it out. Um, this is just a selection of other work that's not currently in the gallery that I've done at some of my previous jobs. I did win an award last year, which was very cool for one of my projects. First project I did at this company was like a video game looking project, and it won a silver award at the Collision Awards. So this is just a bunch of different types of stuff that I do. You can see some's more fun and illustrative. We got some 3D in there. We got some titles, a little bit all over the place kind of a thing. Similar with my, I'm not going to play the video, but similar with my inspirations, they're kind of all over the place. But I like to say I like silly little guys. That's my favorite thing. I really like bright, whimsical, fun work. And these are some motion designers that I really like. Sarah Beth Morgan, absolute top, top, top. If I could just be her, that would be my life's goal as an artist. Ben Marriott makes beautiful textural work that I'm always in awe of. And then EJ is, I design 3D artist. He only makes silly little guys that I want physically in my hands. He does a bunch of 3D stuff and is kind of my inspo for that. So check them out if you're interested in any of kind of the stuff that you'll see. And then what's currently on display. Right now, what's showing in the gallery are 2 pieces for the Spelljammer series for D&D. If you don't know, they just re-released kind of a whole space-themed Dungeons and Dragons, everything but kind of in space, on space ships. And so I worked as a motion designer at Brazen Animation on a couple of different trailers. There are 2 different ones. The top 2 go in the first trailer, the sort of teaser, and then the second 2 are for the launch trailer. We called it Littlest Hamster because it features these hamster characters. And these are specifically some shots that I personally animated. I got a lot more shots in the second, the ones on the bottom with the hamster. I had a lot more responsibilities because of how well I did in the first one. And so I can't show you the proprietary how this was built. I'm going to go a little bit into how I was able to make these shots, you know, beautiful illustrations, a little bit of motion, high level. I'm going to kind of break it down to you with some of my own stuff. Basically what we did here was we had the team design storyboards. Both of them had sound. So we did the storyboards and edited them to sound. Sometimes I help with animating some bits. So, oh, we need to move through a scene. Let's actually have us move through that scene in the animatic so that we can see how everything's going to look kind of in still form before we get all of the illustrations, before we have everything finished. It's kind of just like a rough sketch timed out. And then our visual development team, they're the ones that created the illustrations. We had in-house people working on it, contract people working on it. We were using some of the assets provided by Wizards of the Coast as well and editing them. And then those illustrations are passed on to me, a motion designer. I worked with my boss at the time. We were the only 2 in-house motion designers, and then we had a whole team of them that we worked with all as freelance. So we worked to provide those finished pieces to the editors for the final edit. So we had about, you have this many seconds, this is the action you have to do. And we were all given different little pieces of the whole thing, not really chunks as much as individual scenes. And so I'll kind of walk you through how that process was. Obviously, single motion designer on the team. I take the illustrations and I add motion, and I worked on some of these key skills. This is sort of the scene that I'm just going to use as a demo. It was kind of 2 projects I put into one for different demonstrations, but we have a character there and we have a scene, and there's a little bit of motion on the scene. You can see the clouds are kind of moving. The foreground flowers are moving, and I'll kind of show, again, high level how to do this instead of getting into the nitty gritty. You start with an illustration file. The visual development team usually provides an illustration. For this, I did. It's usually broken up into a bunch of different pieces. This is one of the most important things ever, is naming and labeling those layers and making sure that when you divide it, you're dividing it based on what needs to move. So usually you have each piece of the body, and they have to overlap a little bit because you need some space for them to move. every single individual part. Sometimes you'll have different hands. This character has multiple eyes. You could see it's really small, but you could see there's like 3 different faces in there that I'm going to transition between. And everything also has to be layered properly. So, you know, especially for this, the arms fit correctly. My favorite thing ever is rigging. You do this usually in 3D. It's a really big and important thing, but you do it in 2D as well. This is basically making the bones. Um, as you can see, I kind of have the 3 steps showing this arm. I have the arm tip, which is this red piece. I have the hand, which is green, the forearm, which is yellow, and then the rest of the arm, which is orange. And then this is just the control that I'm moving around with my hand. Basically, it's making what's called an IK rig, which is it automatically moves your elbow, which is really nice. And then you can turn the wrist on its own. Usually you need bones for every part of the body. You can see this in the 3rd image. You got the neck, you got the shoulders. I didn't show all the torso, but there's a little bit of torso. I didn't bother with legs because there aren't legs in this. And that kind of goes to this 4th point, only rig what you have to. It's kind of a time-intensive process. It's great because you can do a lot with your figure once you're done. You're basically making a puppet. If you've ever seen like paper cutout puppets, you're just making that, but digitally. And thankfully, we have the technology to make it kind of automatically work itself out. The next thing is background animation. Obviously, I have my character. Maybe I animated them in their own little scene, whatever. Now I need to make the camera. This one, you can't really see the zoom quite as much because I didn't make it really prevalent. But basically, you're breaking up your layers in the exact same way that you would the figure. Anything that might be moving on its own or something that you want parallaxed a little bit farther back, you can physically make farther back in After Effects. So I'm basically making a stage, if you've ever seen like a stage play. And then each layer itself is animated separately, and I put them together. There's a lot of different techniques on how to animate these things that I think would take way more than the time that we have to demo. But basically, a lot of these are, I have like an effect that kind of makes everything wavy for all of the different clouds. I have an effect that will just automatically make wind that I can like change the speed and the amplitude. And that's for like the front flowers. And then I plot my character into the scene. I'll give them a little bit of lighting to match the rest of the background. And I'll move my camera closer or farther away. And because these are all differently layered in space, they'll move at different amounts. So I'll get a nice little parallax, especially if I want to move up and down. You'll see each layer kind of move separately, and it just feels a little bit more alive and realistic. That was kind of super duper high level. I could get really in depth with it. If you have any questions, I'll give you my info afterwards and I can show you more about that process. But I just wanted to give you a fun little touch of what's in the gallery and how that was made. And then a last little bit of thing, I'm more than just that as well as an artist. You can see I moved my little toucan painting behind me if I'm even still on the mini screen. I do a lot of other work too. I am a motion designer by day, and so I'm in front of my computer for 8 hours. I'm in my room for 8 hours, and I really like getting away from the computer afterwards, and I like being creative on my own, separate from what I do for a client. Especially the nature of my work, everything that I do is for someone else. So it's really nice to do stuff that's for me, like painting, doing ceramics, things that I guess I could sell, but I'm not right now. It's for me. And it's also just like a little tidbit for anybody else who sometimes has that where it's like, oh, I really want to do something for me. I'm doing all this client work. Is this client work also for me? Sometimes it's nice to just kind of separate yourself a little bit. And I've had this tagline since college. I draw the thing and make it move good. It's always going to be relevant to what I do. I kind of do both. There's some information. If you want to screenshot or whatever, follow me, talk to me, whatever. And then I have a couple YouTube links that I can also paste in the chat. That's where you can see the full videos if you want to take a look at them that I helped work on. Again, I did a few scenes. You can see more of the work that I did on those projects on my website. And yeah, don't want to take up too much more time. So, cool.
You, Katie, that was great. We'll turn it over to Dominique.
Hello, everyone. Also bear with me because I also have to share a screen. Ooh, okay, you can see that. Oh, what's happening with my slide? Okay, it's just being slow. Okay, you should see just a blank emerald green screen. So I'll just go ahead. So we are gonna be talking about visual development, developing the vision. Today, my thoughts on visual development, what it is, my relationship to it as a professional, and how it has impacted my personal work. So a little bit about me. I was born and raised in South Jersey. I'm a designated art kid, or was a designated art kid as a in elementary school through high school. And I was determined to go to art school. There was no other option. I applied to 5 schools, got into 4, and became an illustration major. And knew by the end of my time as a freshman, I wanted to do biz dev. Upon graduating, I did City Year, which is a AmeriCorps program, and I did this in Philadelphia. City Year is international and it has many, many sites in the United States. So I decided to transfer to Los Angeles through the program, and I moved cross country in July of 2020 when a little pandemic was happening. And then within like the first 2 weeks of me landing in LA, I was like, I'm just going to apply to the Nick Artist program. I don't think I'm going to get in, but I'm making myself do this. And then by the end of the year, I was an accepted design trainee in the Nick Artist program. And that led to my first foray into visual development art as a professional. So what is viz dev? I made up this definition by myself, and I'm defining it as when you're figuring out, or the process of figuring out, the look of a motion-based project. That is really broad because I'm trying to make sure it encompasses as many media as possible. So here's a couple examples. You see 4, but there's actually 5. So we have The Line. It's a media production house that did a Chobani commercial. There's this multi-studio collaboration for the music video More. There's Pixar Animation Studio. They do feature films like Turning Red. And then Studio MDHR and also Netflix, they collaborated on a animated TV show. The More music video and the Cuphead TV show are also both examples of video games because their origins are video games and these are adaptations into other pieces of media. All of them involve some like different elements of viz dev, and I'm kind of going to use each one to showcase a particular element of the process. So, okay, this is going to play. I'm hoping I can mute it in time. Okay, because you don't really need to like hear it. You just kind of need to say it. So the focus of this is the set design and the environment design. So there were more even examples for this commercial, this Chobani commercial. We're talking about milk and yogurt. They designed a house, they designed the interior of the house, they did background painting, they designed characters, but it's such a vast environment. I wanted to highlight the environment design that was used for, again, milk and yogurt company. There's also, gotta mute this one too. But there's also for something like League of Legends, character design and costume design is big. They had something called skins, which is essentially just the different costumes a character that you can play has as their options. And they have to figure out what this character is going to look like. But they make variations of their costumes. They make character expression sheets. Another thing that is determined through character design, although because this is a pre-existing video game, not as much of a factor, is like proportion. These are relatively realistically portioned versus another piece of media that I'm going to highlight. This More music video also involved keyframes and scene exploration. This is kind of something between storyboarding and I guess a scene painting, but essentially they're exploring like the plot beats or the beats of the actual movement. Like they're wondering, how are we going to frame the subject matter of this project? And then something like Turning Red, for example. So when I mentioned that the proportions of like the characters themselves can be determined through BizDev, Turning Red used a much more, they have like 5 heads like per figure versus like 7 heads for an adult. So they look more compact and like toy-like, think like Mario games. And I'm highlighting the color in the color scripts and the scene paintings where they're determining what colors are we going to use to tell this story and what colors are we going to use for each scene. There's a really strong red and green combo that kind of is a through line throughout this film because it reflects back on the 2 main characters that are represented by red and green. And then lastly, this kind of looks like I'm talking about character design again, but in this case, I'm talking about technique. Cuphead was analog, animated, designed. I don't know if it was painted, but definitely like so much of this game was like handmade, like with pencil on paper with a light box. And I think it took 10 years to make. The creators had to remortgage their house just to make this, even with the backing of like Microsoft. So this game could look like a 1920s, 1930s cartoon and move like it too. So how does all of that affect, and all the different components affect like my professional work as a visual development artist in a union animation studio versus my personal work? Like how am I attributing what I'm learning on the job and the idea of this dev to my personal work? So the main job I've had as a BizDev artist is this show called Transformers Earthspark. It premiered in 2022 and I started working on it in 2021. I essentially was a painter and designer. And this role kind of reflects the skeleton crew nature of the production. There weren't a lot of people on this production, so there was a lot of double duty happening. By the time I got onto the second season, I think I was the only painter, and the only painter, because there was shifts in art director and like people leaving, people going. So I ended up being like the lone painter within like the first year of my career on this show. So part of the designing part is, or the designing aspect of this job is describing 3-dimensional form through line of perspective. It's essentially like a blueprint or like a technical coloring page because someone has to model what I draw in a 3D space. And this does not happen in-house for this production, for this show. So at first it's a design and I send that to the art directors, the executive producer, and they approve it. The design is just based off of something from the script. So they needed a hot dog in this case. And then I also got to paint this. And so here is a hot dog painted by me. Usually there's a texture swatch. I can show examples of texture swatches in other pieces, but there's like reference photos so I can get the color right and the texture right. Like the bread is like a different texture than the hot dog itself. And I'm adding all these elements again, like a glorified coloring book. I was essentially a coloring book. I was just coloring all day, designing and coloring all day. So here's some quick look at like it wasn't just props. This is like a set. I did not design this set, but I did a lot of these textures. These are either modified textures, like here are like the defaults, but the ones that are a little bit bigger, I had to design those like for like the skating ramp or like the ceiling. Here's another piece. It's like a space bridge. Painted this, added the texture for like the walkway, and then I also had to create these sequences, essentially kind of like it will be animated, but I'm essentially like doing a step-by-step recipe of like how this animation should like appear without actually animating it myself. And then here is a prop that I helped design a little bit, like this side view. I hope you can see my cursor, but the design view, the side view, I mean, I had to draw the funnel cake was the only thing designed. We brainstormed a bit for like the topping and then like this fish. There's a context for it. It's not important for what I'm talking about. But yeah, the texture swatches, how to draw these, the paper and the plate, how to design and paint those as well. And then here's like the reference for like the different funnel cake itself and the fish and the whipped cream. So how does that impact my work? Illustration is my major. Visual development is my professional background, so they kind of just naturally come together in my personal work. Um, so I've been working on this story. I'd call it Starlight. I don't think that's going to be the final title, but I've been working on this story since like senior show, just like on and off, like kind of I go into it sometimes and I just I let it be other times. I worked on it for the senior show, as I said, but also for a comic anthology. And then I decided to revisit it for this gallery show. Here's also some drawings that I did while I was at the Nick Artist program. These were just me trying to make notes of like, well, what do the lily pads, what are the thickness of them? Because I wanted them to not feel like, I wanted to explore what I could do with a lily pad shape. Clovers are also, and then a combination of a clover lily. Clovers are also like, I made that like an important feature of this world that I was building. I had mushrooms. I was trying to develop like a unique look for these mushrooms. This is like a glowing lily pad. Here's like a reference, resident 8-year-old for scale. And yeah, I'm gonna just kind of do a spiel as I go through the rest of these. These are just in the show, but my approach to my illustrations are very vis-a in their process. Like I start with these variations of a house. I guess I kind of touched on that in the keyframe aspect, but a lot of what's like character design, the set design, and the keyframes are looking at variations of like the same thing and then deciding which one is the best choice to go into final. This is more illustration. Like I'm not a background designer, which this is also kind of vis of adjacent, but I feel like with a background design, you are going off of the storyboard versus I'm just coming up with compositions myself and turning them into a final illustration. And then I'm also playing around with like color. That's another exploration part. I think the exploration part of this, it's what grabs me the most. And then here is some prop design, like a background design. I hope in the future I can start incorporating more technical variation and skill in the work that I demonstrate, because it's still very illustrative, but I want to show that I can turn things in 3D space and have a more like showing the orthographics and like the blueprints essentially of these designs. And then here's a bit of a rundown of things that I find inspiring as far as like either personally or for fantasy. So for the fantasy aspect, just going through these quickly, there's What We Do in the Shadows, which is a comedy horror vampire mockumentary show. It just ended. The first 4 seasons are great. The 5th and 6th seasons are there. A webcomic called How Hannah's Got a Boy's Name, which is about a paranormal, a really enthusiastic paranormal investigator who one day this dude like knocks on his door and he's like, I'm a zombie and I don't remember anything about my life and I need you to help me. And he ends up being like his right hand man as they keep going on these like chapter episodic adventures to like figure out different paranormal cases throughout their city. It is not it's not finished. The website for it is defunct, but it holds a really special place in my heart because the layout of it is beautiful, but it is really hard to find a way to read this. Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy. I love personifications of death, and I think this is one of the funniest iterations of it because this literal entity of death and mortality loses a bet to children, and now it's like their indentured servant. And I love comedy. There's a through line of comedy, and the last one doesn't break that trend because Dimension 20 is a D&D show. Like you're watching people play D&D, but the people playing D&D are largely entertainers and improv actors. So D&D is already pretty like based on chance. So that adds, and also they're actors, so there's a storytelling expertise there. Highly recommend that show. It's on Dropout though, there's a paywall. Here's like some shows I've been watching. I guess I just wanted to share, and it's already in my slide anyway, but like I've been watching a lot of RuPaul's Drag Race. I've been watching a lot of like Mina Lay's like video essays. I love her approach to research. And I feel like that also speaks to me as someone who likes visual development because research goes in a lot into it. And pop culture is something that I'm always going to pay attention to. I say all of this to share that I'm not really a fantasy buff, but I do like how if I were to make something, I would incorporate something about all of these things and put it in my own work. So I think that's the fun of fantasy for me, where you're just injecting what you like into the genres that you want to play in, like a playground. And then here are two artists that I've been following for almost a decade at this point. We have Nicholas Cole, who is a character designer slash visual development artist, but he is way more character focused. And I love his scene painting. I love the imagination that he's able to articulate through his foundational skills, but his skills are so strong, he kind of could just do whatever. And Cat's Eye has a really great color sense. If you watch Across the Spider-Verse, you can see her color sense really shine through because she had a pretty heavy hand in Gwen's world. And I can also, I have a bunch of like links, I can put them in the chat to be like, these are some things to watch if you want to learn more about any of the media that I mentioned, or just VizDev, because there's a couple videos that were found on YouTube about just the process of animation specifically. And then I have the two artists, you can look at their work as well. And that is it for me. I'm an illustrated visual development artist. You can go to my portfolio, and then there's my email if you want to contact me. But yeah.
Thank you so much, Dom and Katie. I'm going to jump in and say hello to everyone. It's so great to see some former students here and some former staff and familiar faces. So in a way, Dom, you answered one of my questions, which is great because it saves us time. So first of all, thank you both, Katie and Dom, for participating in the show. It was so exciting to be able to have fantasy work in that alum space, facing out towards the street, and have it be seamlessly integrated with the fantasy show that we have up, and to show that our alums are doing the work that is really important that these other artists that we put together are doing as well. So thank you, first of all, for that. Secondly, I'm going to try to, if I can, sort of cover a couple of topics here in a short amount of time. I'm going to ask a couple of questions about fantasy, but also I was really interested, as you were both talking, about world building and what role that plays in what you both do, because you have different kind of stages and components in that process. And then if we have time, I'll round out with one more question. I did want to remind the audience, if you have questions, please drop them into the chat. We'll save time towards the end, and Leah will stop me if I get too enthusiastic and make sure that we get to them as well. As you certainly all know, I can get that way. Okay, so Dom, so you had just talked about what draws you to fantasy. And, you know, even though you said you're not a fantasy buff, you mentioned a couple of things that you really like about it. And so I'm going to ask the same question right now to Katie. And I know you mentioned you like silly little guys. But, you know, if you could just take a moment, and what is it maybe, you know, that draws you to fantasy as an artist? And then Dom, if you wanted to just pop in and add anything after that, that would be great.
Yeah, it's funny because if you were to ask me who in your family is the biggest fantasy person, it's definitely my brother. He's done, I was thinking about this the other night, like when I got those D&D projects, I was more excited to tell my brother, like, oh my God, you play D&D. Whoa, look at this. I'm working on a project. And I got to learn a lot about that sort of that world where it's a little bit more deep into it. One thing that I think of for me, fantasy, a tagline I used to play around with was the idea of making the mundane magical. I like the idea, similar kind of to what Dom was saying in sort of those last points, is that there's something that I personally find very interesting about combining the real world and something fantastical or something slightly out-of-worldly. Like, I love stories where it takes place in the world, but something ties it to something else. Or there's a series of books I read called Fablehaven. It's basically where, like, there's these certain areas where mythical creatures are protected, but you can only see those creatures if you're like in that world or you're the caretaker. So they exist in the world, but nobody knows. And something that makes me really excited because it makes my day-to-day more magical and enjoyable. And so for me, I like those stories that are a little bit softer. Something that I would recommend would be like City of Ghosts, if no one's seen that television series on Netflix. It's a short series. It's really amazing. It talks about different spots in LA that have historical significance, but they frame it as it's actually just interviews with people that were in those spaces, but they frame it as little kids are going around hunting ghosts in those spaces. So the people talking about how this space used to be are the ghosts. And And that's sort of a fun and clever way of like, this is a real space, but we're making it something a little bit more. And that I think is how I connect more with like the fantasy genre.
That's so interesting, and that's part of the reason why we titled the show with the word enchantment, just because of the way you're kind of like, right, you're enchanting the real world or changing, transforming in some way. Dom, did you want to chime in and add anything on there briefly?
I'm trying to see. I feel like, I guess, I want to I guess harping on just like speculative fiction. I think, especially with fantasy, it does ask the question of like, well, what do you want to see that you already haven't seen? And I understand engaging in fantasy that's already established. Like that's why Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter is as has a long standing legacy. Or even like Disney princess movies. But there's just something about like I haven't seen this before and I want to see it. And I think that's really fun. And fantasy kind of also is like boundless more so than like sci-fi. Sci-fi usually asks like there has you I mean there's soft and hard sci-fi, but fantasy really just lets you like go wild. And I like that and just in general.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up too. That was really one of the important things that we wanted to do in the show, was to really kind of emphasize how you can sort of create visions, right, and alternative sort of universes or ways of being in this world, which was really great. Okay, so here's a question that I really am excited to ask both of you, and it wasn't on the list of questions I sent you. So, uh, about world building and immersion. So, what is important for each of you to consider when you're creating a world that's fantasy in a professional context? Let's say when you're working professionally. So, Katie, motion graphics, rigging, right? That illustration file and the labeling and putting that all into action. What are things that are important that you need to consider and keep in mind, because this isn't just our world, right? It has some kind of magical element to it. And then Dom, I'm going to ask you the same question with regard to what you do in your work.
So is the question more like what like sort of world building concepts I'm keeping in mind as I'm working on these?
Yeah, what do you need to constantly be attuned to and aware of, and maybe even with your team? What does your team need to coordinate and communicate? But what's important to make that
Yeah.
immersion happen, right, for the viewer? How do you make sure
Yeah.
immersion takes place?
It's really interesting, especially I think a lot about my current team because I think that I have some of the most creative freedom here than I ever had. And I do a lot of illustration work. I think one of the interesting things is it's gonna sound really cheesy, the vibe. What is the vibe of the project, you know? Because like we do healthcare staffing. So it's like, what's fun and magical about that? Well, some projects that we had was um let's make it in a video game world. Okay, well, how does the video game work? What's the point? What's the goal? Who is the character in the game? You know, what's the story? And how does that story relate to this very real kind of boring thing? Like, we're trying to advertise, come click on our website and here's a job recommendation. How do we make that exciting? How do we make that fun? And so a lot of it is kind of just taking out a big sketchbook and just like drawing stuff being like, okay, what's this part of the journey? What's this part? Meeting up with everybody. I get really in the weeds sometimes with how things look because I'm a very visual designer. Sometimes I lose sight of the bigger picture. And what I really like is working with the team that keeps that specifically in mind. They're not in the weeds like me. And I think when it comes to world building and stuff like that, it's great to have sometimes either just you're of two minds or you have two other people because I will get lost in the weeds every single time. But having either, you know, this is sort of the general, this is everything, this is high level that I can keep referring back to. I think that's what's really important with this type of work, especially for clients, is having big picture and then having the fun stuff that you like to like think about a lot more, but keeping that in mind.
That's really interesting. Yeah. And then Dom, so, you're in the Viz Dev side, the set environmental design, the characters, the props, the keyframes. It's very conceptual, right? So you're kind of like building the setting, you're building the world. And I'm curious, so what are some things that you have to keep in mind when you're doing that?
I feel like I actually get a handle on some of the like the last touches of world building. Like I'm painting, so like the actual design of like how is this space going to function, for the most part, or the subject matter just won't be that fantastical. Like a hot dog is a hot dog. And it's interesting because when Katie mentioned the who, what, when, where, why, like why do we want to do this and like how it's gonna work? It also sounds like the projects are being built from the ground up. Transformers is old. It's like 45 years old. There's like preset, like if you have Transformers and you don't have Megatron or Optimus, like people are gonna be like, what is actually? Now I'm saying that out loud. I'm just like, that would make me wonder, like, so what is this about? But we do have those characters, and therefore, we have a dynamic that already exists. And I'm not in the writer's room. I feel like I'm definitely getting the finishing touches. Like I'm icing the cake. The cake is already baked. I didn't choose the flavor. I didn't choose the icing color, but I'm in charge of like making sure the icing is smooth and making sure the decorations are in place and making sure the cake is chilled. So I feel like there are opportunities in biz dev, even for someone who's like more painting than designing, because I can choose the color. I can choose like I can communicate story through like wear and tear, or at least reflect the script back. But professionally, as like on Transformers actually wasn't really building that much. I was building on top of what already was established, as opposed to adding anything of my own, which is fine. That is sometimes the job of a biz dev artist.
That's really interesting too. In the show, we have some works that are maps and things that come from those long traditions of worlds that have been around for 30, 40 years. And there's like constantly this lore, and you have to make sure you're consistent with the lore, and there's a lore master and all this kind of stuff, right? So that you're not deviating in some way, and then someone on some fandom site's gonna like notice and call out, and right, it's gonna be a big thing. So my other question that has a professional kind of a bent has to do with, can you each talk about, was there a time when you had to revise your work based on feedback from a client or someone above you in the director seat or in a team situation? And how did you navigate that, just for our people heading out into the workforce? I'll let either of you go first.
I'll jump in. So I actually I changed something about my presentation when I saw that question, because I was like, oh, I have a story to go with the piece, so might as well just like swap this out. And it was that the funnel cake piece. So it started just with the design, because for most of the time, I get my prompt, I kind of send it. They gave me a couple notes, and I send it back, and it's like fine. But in that one, they kept adding things, and I remember I probably thought at one point, like, why didn't they figure this out before they got to me? Because now I'm doing painting and design, and I don't really love the back and forth all the time, but I'm like, well, this is my job, and this is also a really silly thing to get mad about. But it was just a funnel cake, and I painted the funnel cake. Then they're like, well, we need weird toppings. So I brainstormed some weird toppings on top for it needed to be weird. I forgot why. I think we probably had pickles and like maybe chili flakes, but we landed on like the fish and the whipped cream. And so I had to design that, color that, and then they were like, oh, we need a side view profile too. And like I had to design that too. And then they were like, we need a 4K fish of like a 4K like a render of the fish. I had to like take the fish, blow it up, paint it over again. And then I think finally it was done. And the plate and the paper, I had to add that too. So I almost didn't put that in my prop design portfolio, but then I remembered how many times I had to add elements that weren't already drawn. I was like, this counts as prop design for me now. So that was the time where and it was a fun assignment, so I can't complain too much. But yeah, it was a lot of back and forth because they just kept adding stuff. And it wasn't a reflection of like me, maybe, but just like top down was like, oh, we need this. And then person overseeing me is like, you got to do this.
Interesting. How about you, Katie? Have you had that situation?
I've had a completely different thing in my brain, but that just triggered a memory for me. My first job, I was given the opportunity to help recreate our illustration style because it just wasn't really working for motion. Everything was like an outline, and there wasn't a lot of detail. There wasn't a lot of depth. And so I was working with the creative director, the art directors to try and work on it because illustration was more of my specialty in the company. And we had one person that just didn't like anything, regardless of what happened. It was more of like everybody was on board. Then we brought it to this person who was slightly outside of the project, didn't necessarily have to be involved, but really wanted to be. And regardless of what we did, it was like, actually, we did it this way. So I want it this way. Okay, well, how about this compromise? No, I want it this way. How about this compromise? No, I want it this way. And it was, I also saw it really wear down like the art directors that were in the room with me and everybody else. And it was funny because they would come up to me a lot and they'd be like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. And, regardless of whether it was frustrating, everybody was like talking to me as if it was something that was really personal to me. And I was really lucky that I had parents that are artists. They were art directors. And my dad would come home, do freelance. I'd see him just like in front of the computer, like, this client is so dumb. They don't know what they want, and like getting really stressed out about it. And so I've kind of practiced since high school, just kind of detaching myself from my 9 to 5. And I talked about this with Dominique before, like a few times, is that I have this very uncanny ability to like be passionate about what I'm doing, but also just like, I wouldn't be doing this probably in my free time. Like it's fun. I'm glad I'm doing this for my job, but it's a job. And so for me, navigating that situation, I'll fight for things if I think they're right. But for the most part, I would rather be someone that's easy to work with than someone that's just going to fight the whole time. It's just kind of worked better for me. So I just get to the point where I'm like, guys, I'm not taking this personally. Like, let's just change it. If we're making a minor improvement, like we can slowly build up to something bigger once we can prove that maybe this is the way to go, or maybe it's not. I don't know. I was green at the time. So I was like, I'm just trying to help. And so for me, a lot of the time when I run into those, fortunately, I don't really get that much anymore. I'm kind of the illustrator at my company right now, which is kind of awesome. I just get to draw things and they're like, woo! Yeah, I'm like, oh, it's not the best work I've ever done. This is amazing. Love that. Makes me so happy. And so, yeah, part of it is a little bit of detachment, which kind of sometimes sounds sad, but like, it's your job, like what Dominique was saying, like, it was a fun project. I don't like all the revisions. It's my job though. I'm getting paid to do something that maybe I don't like. And, the sooner I think that you can get to that point as an artist who's working in the commercial field, I think the way better time you're going to have and the way less burnt out you're going to get as well.
Great. I have one or two really quick questions, but I'm going to hold off on them because I did see that we had a question. Deanna had one in the chat. So Leah, do you want to?
Sure, yeah. Deanna was asking, Dom specifically, you mentioned research is really important within the visual development world. So can you talk a little bit more about what that looks like? And then Katie, too, if you have anything to add about how research informs your creative process.
Okay, so mood boards come straight to mind, like especially when you're doing something from the ground up, or you get the chance, certain positions like a production designer or an art director, they get to choose the look of, when they choose the look of the project, or what exactly this asset or this prop set background, whatever it needs to be referenced off of. So you're usually sourcing images, like Google search, and like I used Unsplash a lot, especially for like texture. Any sort of like free licensed like photo. Honestly, I think I probably saw some like Shutter stock stuff. Let's like, who cares? Like we like just pulling it off of like the website with the watermark and just putting it in there, because I'm like, if that's just for our reference. But a lot of reference images is typically the research. Sometimes though, so Transformers has a character who has a disability. She has like a prosthetic leg, and we had someone named Maya. I forgot her exact position, but she would kind of be she would give us information about like cultural, or like anything that was like, we need more information because of sensitivity, because we don't want to represent this because there's a legacy of people misrepresenting something. So she would actually feed information to like about set design, like how, if you had a wheelchair user in this scene or in this show, you need a ramp for this house, which would affect how the house is designed and also how it's modeled and built, like how, because otherwise it disrupts the immersion. So stuff like that, when it comes to like the visuals, it's usually like a reference board. Some characterization, or like, I guess, functionality of a character that needs more research, or I think like weapons even can use like functionality research, like how does this move and how are we going to test this out. But yeah, I'm trying to think of any other like world building things, and my mind's just going to how like certain animators act out their scenes, but that's not biz dev, that's animation. But yeah, I you can always email me if you have more questions, because I'm trying to like succinctly describe it. But yeah, I think of mood boards for sure, especially in my case.
I just want to say there's an article that I have the history of fantasy art students read by an author, Sarah Chorn. It's called Why Do All Castles Have Stairs? And it's a really amazing discussion about representation of disability and ableism in fantasy. So if anyone's interested, you can just find it on the internet. It's called Why Do All Castles Have Stairs? But go ahead, Katie.
No, that's really cool. We actually, funny enough, it's less fun sometimes, but I work for a healthcare staffing company. I need to know all of these different healthcare positions. I know so much about healthcare and I haven't worked a day in healthcare. I can tell you like our top people, like different types of positions that we look for. I can tell you the places in which we need to cater to more. And so sometimes the research is a little bit less of like, we do stuff for holidays too. Like we're doing something for Ramadan. I don't celebrate Ramadan. I had a call with someone who does celebrate it, giving some more insight on, oh, maybe picture this, maybe don't picture this, here's some ins and outs. I can get you more information if you need it. So we do have some aspect of especially like cultural stuff, especially like we're very customer focused. And so we want to make sure that we're representing people in the same way, like well, accurately, and not, harboring any misinformation, as well as just like information about the thing in which we are doing. Like a lot of motion graphics is going to be advertisement and advertising something. And you might not know about the product. And when I worked at Viasat, I didn't know about satellites. I had to learn, what is this? What is this type of satellite? What does this mean? What is this government contract that we have? There's a lot of like learning about things that like I genuinely don't fully understand, but I need to understand enough to picture it well. And then we'll have the people who really know what's going on take a look at it afterwards. So a lot of it is just like researching, what is it that I'm communicating and how am I supposed to communicate it?
That's great. Leah, do you have any other questions, or should I ask my last question or two?
It looks like Mary Jennings just popped a question into the chat.
Oh, okay, go ahead.
She's wondering about how AI has impacted your work and your research, and whether there's a way that you can protect your work under this circumstance and the use of AI.
This is such a hot topic in animation. This is actually such a focus of our contract negotiation. So animation, if you're in LA and you work in animation, whatever studio you can think of, it's under the Guild. The Guild has existed since like 1952, I want to say. Like Hanna-Barbera was one of the first, and that's like old Warner Brothers. Gen AI was one of the big asks that people in our union was like, we need really like firm protections, and the studios just would not budge. So there's already like a fight about that, and a worry that between outsourcing jobs and Gen AI, that and also the fact that we don't have minimum staffing protections, that a studio could hypothetically staff one person to do multiple jobs, because it's like, well, you can just generate everything through AI. Yeah, I know that there's a Gen AI committee. I'm using Gen AI specifically because I know AI is like the buzzword, but it's Gen AI that's the data scrapper. That's the one that's like stealing and like Frankensteining stuff. But yeah, that is a lot of animation people are like against it. And honestly, if someone gets a whiff of you liking it, they can and probably will report you to like someone in the union, because there's like a committee like against that. It's like because it's a threat to our jobs, and yeah, and threat to I've seen independent people outside of animation, but who have like very distinct art styles. Like they witness their working scrap, like someone's copying my stuff and this is my style. So yeah, it's pretty anti Gen AI over here. But protection wise, there's nothing there's the legal protections right now with the current contract of the union. It is pretty loose. It could be tighter, but it's not nothing. I can't remember the language exactly, to be honest, but yeah, there's nothing saying that without the staffing minimums, there's nothing saying that they can't ask people to use AI. Now, if you don't want to use it, that's one thing, but there's nothing banning AI from the studio, I don't think.
Katie, do you
outright.
want-
I think I'll do it really quick. It depends for motion graphics where you're working, because there's going to be plenty of places that do use AI. I know some people that especially use AI voiceover is really big. We technically do, but we only use it as an intermediate when we're trying to time things out. We actually do pay for every single time someone to do voiceover. We basically just are like, we need something to cut the animation to. We'll send it to them and be like, please make this better. This is literally just because we needed to time the animation before we sent this to you, because our process is a little different. But where I'm at, we don't want AI. We don't want AI imagery. It'll depend on where you're at for motion graphics.
Fiction world is exactly the same. Scraping and all that stuff. Okay, I have one last question because we have a couple of minutes left, and it's a quick one. You kind of both did it already, but I'm going to have you do it again. And if you could add one work to a fantasy must watch, must read, must play, if it's a game, what would it be and why? So, Katie, you want to go first, and then Tom?
Sorry, I was looking it up so I could put the link in there. City of Ghosts. It's really good. I forgot about it for a long time. Not just because of the aspects of, the real life. It's very educational too, just the way in which what they're talking about. It's also 2D mixed with 3D, and I think it's
cool.
beautiful. I want to work on that kind of stuff so bad. It's really pretty, and it's just really insightful, and it's really quick. So highly recommend that.
Great. Dom, do you have one? I think you're muted too, just so you know when you're ready.
Yeah. I'm copying Katie because I wanted to add a link too. I think
great.
this is the right link. I'm just gonna say Dimension 20 again. I think because it's such a Russian roulette of a show, it is long. Like the episode, I remember one episode they uploaded and it was like 1 hour and a half, and I was like, oh, it's so short because the episodes are so long because they're playing a tabletop game. But you're essentially watching professional improv people play different genres, and the first one essentially is just D&D and Breakfast Club. So if you like it is like they're teenagers as D&D like classes and characters, and it's I think it's hilarious. And they're also like just they have they tend to lean funny, and I like to laugh. So, and then there's different seasons that go through different genres, but yeah, I think there's something for everyone. Just know that the episodes are long. Like I cheered when it was a 3-hour episode. I was like, I'm set. I loved it. So here's
great.
here's the show.
Well, thank you both so much for being in the show and for doing this talk, which was wonderful. I'm going to turn it over to Leah to close us out.
Yes, thank you. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for your great questions and engaging in this conversation. Dominique and Katie, I feel like you gave us a wonderful crash course today on motion design and visual development. So thank you. I know we probably barely scratched the surface, but this was a really fascinating conversation. And thank you, Jonathan, for moderating at the end there. So if you are local or if you're planning a visit to Philly, be sure to check out Fantasy Spell in the galleries before it closes. The show closes March 15th. Katie and Dom's work will be on view through March 1st. It's not to be missed. And before we sign off, I want to be sure to invite you all to some of our upcoming alumni events. So we have the opening reception for Janie Gross Furthermore that's scheduled on Friday, March 7th. That's going to be a great opportunity to connect in person, get inspired, and just continue to celebrate the creativity of our more alumni. And of course, the alumni reunion is coming up on May 2nd and 3rd. So I'll drop the registration links to both of those events in the chat for you. So be sure to check those out. And thanks again for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you again soon.